We might not actually get to Genesis 1 through 11 today. We might. This might not take as long as I think it might. We'll just see. We're going to begin by talking generally about the Old Testament before we actually start reading the Old Testament. I want to make one other comment. One other comment about reading and how to read. No. I almost assigned, didn't obviously, but I almost assigned a book by the literary critic and writer and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis called An Experiment in Criticism. Yeah. It's one of the very last books he wrote. Is actually published, if I remember correctly, just after he died. And what it's really about is how you read a book. It's not called How to Read a Book. Other people have written books, lots of books called How to Read a Book. But it's really about how to be a good reader of a book. Okay? And in it, Lewis distinguishes between two kinds of readers. Okay? One kind of reader reads, say, a novel possibly, or a story, or pretty much anything, as if that material that he or she is reading is a mine, like a gold mine. Right? Why do you dig in a gold mine? To find gold. In other words, you're digging for a purpose. The purpose is to discover what is hidden there. Okay? So you start out with a set, so to speak, methodology. You want to get what? The good stuff. So what does that mean about everything else? In a gold mine, not everything's gold, right? What do you have to get through in order to get to the gold? Awful lot of dirt. Or, a little more colloquially, an awful lot of crap. A lot of quote-unquote unuseful stuff, okay? Books can be approached the same way. Books can be approached from the attitude of, I want to get what's important out of it. Just the meat, nothing else. Okay? That's one way of reading, Lewis says. The other way of reading is to approach the book not as a mine, but instead as the ocean. I'm going to assume for the moment, here's one of those presuppositions I was talking about the other day. I'm going to assume for the moment that all of you like the ocean, that all of you have been to the ocean, all of you have been in the ocean, okay? How do you experience the ocean? Not the sand, not the shore, not the sun, the ocean itself. What do you have to do? Louder. Get in. Go in. How far? So your toes are covered? That's not going to the beach, folks. Going to the beach means what? You go all the way in. All the way under. Why? Well, that's how you experience the totality, let's say, of the ocean, right? Lewis says that's how some people approach reading. That is, how many of you have read the Harry Potter novels? I know some of you have. Really, only 3. You guys are poorly educated. Read the Harry Potter novels. In one of the Harry Potter novels, Harry dives into a book, literally. He opens a book and he literally gets sucked inside it. Okay? J.K. Rowling is saying something there about reading. That's how you ought to read. Okay? Lewis's point is, if you approach, I don't have any other than the good book. I don't have any good books in front of me. I got Shakespeare over here. I can use Shakespeare. to give a real good example of this. Lewis's point is the two different approaches say an awful lot about the person doing the approaching. If you approach a work of literature, or let's say maybe a film, just to get what you can out of it, to see what the author's point is, to get the message, that's one kind of reading. The other kind of reading is to do what? Let the book, like the water of the ocean, do what? Encompass you. Wash over you. Okay? He uses another image of that second kind of reader. Actually, let me back up. He uses another image for both readers. For one kind of reader, the book is an intellectual curiosity. The story is an intellectual curiosity. You read it to try to figure out what it is. For the other kind of reader, the book becomes like food. What do you do with food? Thank you. You eat it. You put it in yourself. Then what happens to it? Gets digested. What happens in the digestion process? They break down into its nutrients. So what happened to the nutrients? Where do they go? Throughout your body, right? They go all throughout your body. That is, the food becomes transformed into what doesn't become waste? You. So, that salad becomes you, except for the waste part. Lewis says that's what happens with the second reader. That material that he or she reads enters into you and does what? Just like food does. It changes you. It transforms you. Because what happens if you suddenly go from having a good diet, not being on a diet, but just eating well, to eating really poorly, Twinkies every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nothing else. Water. You go from eating a nice healthy diet to only Twinkies. What's going to happen to your body? You're going to become a Twinkie, essentially. Well, that's the transformation. Lewis says that second kind of reader takes that book in and is changed by it. Probably obvious which reader he regards as a good reader. The second reader is a good reader. Why? Because every time he or she reads something, they are changed by what they read. How? Because they allow what it is they're reading to do the changing. That is, they don't approach that work like, ooh, this is dangerous. I've got to have all of my mental faculties in charge and controlling it. No, they're kind of like, let me put it this way. Are you 100% guarded when you meet a new person? Somebody for the first time? That is, are all the walls up? No, they're not. How do you know? Because you're meeting that person. If the walls were up, what would happen? You wouldn't talk to that person. What else? Go even farther back than that.
You wouldn't even meet him.
You wouldn't even meet him. If you were totally guarded, how would you live your life? 4 walls, ceiling, floor, no door. You would never meet anybody else. Okay? So you have to be a little bit open. Lewis says reading a book is the same kind of way. You have to be open to it. You have to allow it to work on you. Extrapolate from that to a conversation. Okay? Because that's why, in writing about literature, every English teacher you will have, hopefully, will say that when you write about a work of literature, say we have an exam come up in, not say it because we will, have an exam come up in a few weeks. And the exam will be over, I don't remember what it is, kind of the opening books of the Old Testament. Okay? How do you write about that? You write in tense, that is past, present, future. You write using the present tense. Why? If you're writing about, my next class is Shakespeare, and I've got students writing papers in there, or will have students writing papers in there, they won't say, unless the event they're talking about happened in the past, they won't say, Shakespeare wrote that. They'll say, Shakespeare writes. Or, Prince Hamlet suggests. Why is that in present tense?
Because they're immersing themselves in it.
Okay. Why else? What happens when you read anything? You're immersing yourself in it, but what's going on really? You're entering into that conversation. That, in terms of a nonfiction book, yeah, it's a lot easier. If you're reading an essay, the essayist is writing to you when. Not when the essayist wrote the essay. French essayist, Michel Montaigne. He wrote 400 years ago. He's been dead a long time. But when you pick up his essays today, it's like he's sitting across from you. Now, it's kind of a one-sided conversation because you don't get an answer back, right? Unless you do what? Write in your book. Underline. Say, no, this is stupid. Okay? So, you're part of a conversation that's going on. When does this conversation begin? In the beginning, that's how far back. Whenever that in the beginning, is. So, what's happening as we're reading it is present, so to speak, even if it's a historical book. So, our participation is now, not yesterday. It's not looking backwards. It's as if it's occurring right now, so to speak. Right? So, as you read, primarily this much more so than this. Because this is what? This is totally nonfiction. Nonfiction, non-imaginary, non-imaginative, non-fantasy, if you want, non-creative. This is kind of boring. I'll be honest with you. It's not as boring as the Harbrace Handbook or, some other grammar guide, but it's kind of boring. Some of this will be boring. Some of it hopefully won't be, because if it is, parts of it at least, if it is all totally boring, there's something wrong with you and not with this. That you're not getting excited, motivated, angered, whatever by. Okay? So, as you read, try to take off your blinders. What do I mean by blinders? Those things that don't allow you to see what it's actually saying. We all have them. Every person in this room, whether you have them physically or not, you're wearing a set of these. Okay? It's your background. It's your what's called worldview. It's how you view the world. Try as much as possible to take them off, to see what's being said. Okay? Enough of that. So, background. The course is called, literally, its actual, I looked it up. Its actual title in the course catalog is The Bible and Literature. Let's take those two terms for a moment, not too long, and talk about them. Bible, literature. Look at the second one first, because the first one's going to be part of this stuff. What's literature? Anybody. Books.
Any written work.
Any written work. This is literature. It's written. What kind of literature is it? Informative. definitely nonfiction, right? In case of tornado. It's not in case of Thanos. Because Thanos isn't real. It's not in case of Lord Voldemort walks down the hall because he's, that's nonfiction. Even as a form of nonfiction. Is that good literature? Define good. Is it informative? Yeah. Define good with informative. It gets a little sketchy. So, literature, kind of more strictly defined, tends to imply imaginative literature. What do I mean by imaginative? Every one of you has an imagination. It might be well developed. It might be poorly developed. By the time I graduated high school, my imagination was pretty well stifled. Why? Because I spent too many hours in front of this stupid one-eyed monster, the television. Don't try to get into a trivia game with me about the 1970s, especially if it regards TV, because I'll wipe the floor with you because it's still there. You can't erase it. You can only pack more stuff in, hopefully. Okay? So, imaginative literature. What's the imagination do? Creates. From what? Your thoughts? Where do your thoughts come from? If you can answer that question, you're a brilliant person, because nobody really knows. Yeah, we say there's electrochemical processes going on in the brain, but we can't put an electrode and go psst, and make an idea or a particular idea appear. It's getting kind of scary, because now they can do things where they can translate literal thoughts into, we're just starting to see the beginning of this, words on a screen, where certain waves produce the on a screen. Okay? Can be very beneficial for some people. Personally, I think that's scary as all hell. So, thoughts, it's creativity, it comes from your thoughts. What do your thoughts use? Somebody, name something imaginary. A unicorn. Why is that imaginary? Because they're not real. So, imagination has something to do with unreality. But where do we get the idea of a unicorn from? If they're not real, how did they come about? Somebody else's thoughts? Real objects. What else?
Our perception of it.
Our perception of what? If it's not real, how do we have a perception of it, right? Well, what's a unicorn look like? A horse with a horn. Are there any animals in the wild that have a single horn?
Yes.
Yes, there are. Are there any horses that have single horns? Not usually. Every now and then there's a weird, animal born with a horn deformity, and it shows up in the Times of India or something like that, etc. Okay? So the imagination has to take things, reality that we see, and then does what with it? It kind of rearranges stuff to make these things. And if we create a story about it, you have literature. Does the literature have to be written? No, it doesn't. Scary story around a campfire. That's literature. It's just oral literature. It doesn't have to be written down. Okay? So, the Bible and literature. The course is supposed to be, if I were to follow the course outline as it was first proposed and all that, we'd read a story or something from the Bible, and then we'd look at some kind of modern adaptation of that or something that builds upon that, and we'll do some of that. For example, when we get to the Gospels, we're going to read all of the Gospels, and so we'll see all of Christ's parables, and we're going to take a little segue to a short story, we won't spend long on it, by Flannery O'Connor, 20th century Catholic writer from dead center Milledgeville, Georgia. And to be a Catholic in the middle of Georgia in the 1940s and 50s Not a good thing to be, okay? Because you're, smack dab Southern Baptist territory. So, literature. That part's fairly easy. The Bible. What is the Bible? Because a lot of people today, meaning 2019, and even going back 20 or 30 years, there is no single Bible. It's been divided. 100 years ago, nobody referred to it as multiple Bibles. Now it's the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. Well, where's the term Bible come from? It's Greek. What's it just mean? It comes from Biblia, B-I-B-L-I-A, which means books. Books, plural. It's the books. It's not the book. Right? So what's the difference between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible? Well, this is what is commonly called only, today, 2019, only among certain groups, the Old Testament. This is the Old Testament and the New Testament. Notice, within the kind of terminology I'm using, describing today, this says what? Notice the word testament has a modifier, right? What's the modifier? Old. What do you want? Old car, new car. Old clothes, new clothes. Old food, new food. Yeah. Pretty much people like the new better. Why? Because the old is superseded. The old is out of date. Old Testament, New Testament. Why is it new? Because it's newer than the Old Testament. Okay, so what else does that mean, though? That it, for some, it supersedes the Old Testament. That is, it surpasses, it goes beyond, it completes, okay, within the Christian tradition. Now, as I said, prior to probably about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more, nobody referred to this as this. It was the Jewish scriptures. What does the word scriptures mean? Holy isn't implied. Saintly, sanctified isn't implied. Every one of you, some of you are doing it right now, are writing scriptures. Why? Because you're writing. That's all scriptures mean, writing. Writings, plural. Right? So, you've got this and this. So, why is it the Bible in literature? Why is it that the Jewish and Christian Bible as literature? Well, this single word, even today, still kind of subsumes both of these. Though for many, I'll go ahead and use a pejorative term to describe them, pinheaded English professors, that's kind of a disservice to Jews. All right? Political correctness, in other words. But we're going to focus throughout the course on the entirety of this, called this. Why? Because from roughly 350 AD to roughly 1900, this is all it was called. It wasn't called the Christian Bible. It wasn't called the Jewish Bible. They called those documents that some only refer to as the Jewish Scriptures, they called the Jewish Scriptures a little bit later, right? But it was called this. And when we talk about this as this, the Bible and literature. When we talk about the and literature, we're talking about the influence of this on this. See, if you go to the Middle Ages, a lot of emphasis of the entirety on stories. Almost no emphasis on the single entity known as this, just the Old Testament. It's the combination of the two. That's why we got to get the terminology down. Okay? So, now let's go back to, we're not discussing the entirety. We're discussing this first part. The Hebrew Old Testament, not quite. Why not quite? Because those books that are called the Old Testament aren't only written in Hebrew. Even when they were originally written, they weren't only written in Hebrew. Portions of a couple of them were written in Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke. Okay? They were written in Aramaic during what's called the Babylonian captivity. Part of Daniel, part of Ruth, I can't remember what else, part of Esther maybe, were written in Aramaic, right? Because that's kind of the local language that was spoken. So, speaking about what's generally called the Old Testament, it exists in two major forms. Two major forms. You have the Hebrew Old Testament, that is, those books written in the Hebrew language, all right? And then you have the Septuagint Old Testament, right? And that is these books, this material, translated into Greek, okay? Translated around 250 BC. But we're going to leave the Septuagint alone for a moment. We're going to go to the Hebrew Old Testament. This is pretty much all straight out of the opening material of the Oxford Annotated Bible. Okay? So, the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anybody know when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered? 1947. 1947. That's what, 60, 72 years ago? Okay. A Bedouin, wandering shepherd, kind of person, was doing something. I don't remember what. And he goes into a cave overlooking the Dead Sea, and he finds in that cave these big jars. Not like our modern glass jars, big ceramic jars, big, like this big, hold 25, 40 gallons, okay? In the Gospels, when we're told of Jesus' first miracle, the wedding at Cana, and the guy brings water to him, Jesus says, bring me some water, because he's going to do his first miracle, and he turns water into wine. It's these big jugs. Okay? They're having a good wedding party, right? So, this guy goes in and he finds these big jugs, and inside of these jugs are rolls of papyrus. Papyrus is an early writing material. What we get the word paper from, but it's not paper. It's a plant material, okay? Lo and behold, these fragments contain portions of every book of the Old Testament except for one, the book of Esther. And they include the entire book of the prophecy of Isaiah. Prior to this, the oldest, I've got a note here somewhere. Prior to this, the oldest version come from 400 AD. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated from 200 BC to 70 AD. That is, the earliest portion of them comes from 200 BC. Prior to 1947, because these weren't known until then, the earliest known manuscript material of the Old Testament was from 400 AD. So suddenly, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, by the way, if you get curious, you can look at online. All of them have been scanned. So they're all available online if you want to learn Hebrew. There's translations available and all that kind of stuff. So once these are discovered, we now have versions, or at least a version of Isaiah that is 600 years older than the previously known one. And when you go back to 200 BC, I don't know for sure, I'm not a biblical scholar, if the Isaiah portion goes back that far, then we're what? We're within 400, 500 years of Isaiah's life. In other words, it's like us and Shakespeare. As opposed to us and William the Conqueror, about 1,000 years ago almost. Okay? You get a lot closer to when the person lived and what is more likely. You have more accuracy, all that kind of stuff. Okay? So the Hebrew Old Testament is divided into 3 major sections. 1, 2, 3. And in that kind of order, you have the Pentateuch, or what's called the Law, the Torah, or the Torah. And the Law, or the Torah, is also called the Pentateuch. It's the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the beginning. Why? Because everything else rests upon and flows from those 5 books, essentially. So that when a person comes to Jesus in the Gospels and says, Master, what are the most important, commandments? And Jesus replies, well, what's in the law and the prophets? Okay. Notice, he's just talked about those 2. It's not because he doesn't know about these, but it's because he's saying, these are the ones that really get at what? Our interaction with each other and such, and interaction with God. Okay? These are really more about what God's going to do. Okay? So, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the first 5. After that comes the prophets. Prophets are divided into what are called the former prophets and the latter prophets, or if you want to call it, the earlier and the later. The former prophets are the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, in the Hebrew Old Testament, Samuel, which in your Oxford Annotated Bible is 2 books, Samuel's just one big long book. And Kings, which is 2 books, is one big long book. Okay? Some versions, Kings is 4 books. So, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Those are the prophets. Kind of interesting that Joshua, the book of Joshua, is considered a prophetic book. Because prophecy usually implies what? Foretelling, right? Telling the future. You go to a prophet for what purpose? Not to tell you what yesterday was like, but to tell you what tomorrow is going to be like. But biblical prophecy has 2 components. Foretelling, telling it before it's going to happen. And a virgin shall conceive, Isaiah talks about, which all varieties, flavors, denominations, etc., of Christians say that is a biblical prophecy about the birth of the Messiah, etc. Okay? But it's also what? Forthtelling. We have the phrase today, speak truth to power. That's prophecy. That is telling the truth now. Always a good thing to do? We rephrase that. Always a safe thing to do? No. Because what theoretically can happen if you tell the truth to someone who's not equipped to handle the truth. And I don't mean the truth, some deep spiritual truth. I mean, oh king, you're being an ass, and you're going to pay for it. We could extrapolate, right, to today. What does Trump do if someone goes after him? He doesn't hold anything back, right? Okay? People speak truth to him. It's not the truth he wants to hear, so they get fired, etc. Okay? So, foretelling. So you have these, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Judges, kind of interesting again, that like Joshua, that's considered prophecy. Because that's all about the people who were kind of guiding the Israelites after they get into the land of Canaan, after Moses and Joshua did. There's very little actual prophecy there. And then you have the latter prophets, which are divided into two groups. The major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the minor prophets, all the others. There's 12 of them. From Hosea in the Old Testament to Malachi. Okay? Then, in the Hebrew Old Testament, then you get what are called the writings. That is, the Hebrew Old Testament does not end like every Protestant Old Testament ends. It doesn't end with the book of Malachi. Malachi's got all kinds of prophecy about the coming Messiah. But Malachi is written about 400 years before Christ. Sort of a long period of silence. Well, in the Hebrew Old Testament, what comes after the prophets are the writings. Ruth, book of Ruth, Lamentations, Daniel, parts of the Psalms, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay? 1st and 2nd Chronicles, read them. It's all history. So-and-so did so-and-so. So-and-so was a bad king. God brought him down. So-and-so, was raised up. Yeah, he was a bad king too. He gets killed. So-and-so. Okay? So that's essentially the order. I've left one or two out. For example, the book of Nehemiah is not included as a separate book. It's or Ezra. They're included in another book. I think it's all spelled out in your introduction, right? Now let's look at the Septuagint. So these materials, from what we can tell, are probably actually written down in the form we kind of have them today. That doesn't mean earliest manuscripts. It means the shape we have them today that then get copied into those earliest manuscripts that still survive. Probably written down sometime in the 6th to 5th century BC. 6th to 5th century is roughly 500 to 700. Moses lived long before then. Okay? So the stories of Moses, the Pentateuch, that material, that gets handed down orally, more than likely. Now there might be some written materials that we just haven't found. It would be a mind-blowing discovery for biblical archaeologists to discover a roll of papyrus that, dated, say, 1200 BC. There are papyrus fragments that do date that old. They're primarily Egyptian, and they're covered in hieroglyphics. Right? But if an Old Testament book, let's say, Genesis, if a fragment of that was discovered from 1200 BC, well, let's go even further back. 1600 BC. And it was shown, okay, this is definitely Genesis. There would be an awful lot of people today scrambling to cover their backsides intellectually because of arguments that there was no way any of this material could have been written before roughly 600 BC. Okay? If it were 1600 BC, as an example, that would predate, if we take chronology into account, that would predate Abraham. So it would come between Moses and Abraham. Today, many biblical scholars think Abraham is purely fictitious. He's imaginary. Somebody created him. Why? He's part of the story. Okay? And then all of this is entirely fictitious. You can do that. Which one? Okay, so let's go to the Septuagint. So what's the Septuagint? I mentioned it's a Greek translation. Well, why would you translate the Old Testament Hebrew material into Greek? Well, it's not for Greeks. It's for Jews who don't live in Israel. It's for Jews who live in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay? And there's a story that goes with the translation. There's a letter. The letter doesn't survive from 250 AD, but the letter says, here's what happened. That how do I want to put this? To help the Jews living in Alexandria who don't speak Hebrew, right? But who speak Greek, because Alexandria is a Greek town. Notice who it's named after. Alexander the Great, right? So there are this large population of Jews, and they want to know about their own religion. They want to understand their heritage better. They can't read Hebrew, so even if they have the Hebrew Old Testament, it is gobbledygook to them. They want to be able to read it. So this guy, might be mentioned in Riken, he commissions, according to different versions of the story, either 70 or 72 scholars, kind of rabbinical scholars if you want, to translate the Old Testament. 72 different individuals are going to translate all of this from Hebrew into Greek. And according to the story, according to the letter that we have, they do. And each one of them translates it, and all of their translations match identically. Now, on a purely quote-unquote human basis, if all of you, let's say, had studied Latin for 8 years, so you thought, you dreamed in Latin, and I were to bring in a text in Latin and gave you all a copy and said, okay, translate this into English. Guess what? I would have 22 different translations. They would not match. There's no way. So what does that mean? This must be divinely inspired in order for 72 different people to get everything, what Jesus will call every jot and iota, every crossing of the T and every dotting of an I, okay, matches perfectly, 100%, no variation, okay? That's the Septuagint. Septuagint means the 70, okay? So, as I said, some say it's 70 scholars, others say it's 72, somewhere between 70 and 72, okay? This happens around 250 BC. The oldest manuscripts of the Septuagint that survive are from 100 to 400 AD. Okay, so if this happens in 250 BC and the earliest surviving manuscript is 100 BC, that puts the earliest surviving manuscript within 350 years of that translation event. So here, the earliest surviving of the Dead Sea Scrolls is 200 BC, and it's thought, because we don't have any from earlier, it's thought that at least most of this was probably written sometime between the 5th and 6th century. That's 300 to 400 years. So roughly about the same time frame in terms of when something is written to the surviving material. Okay? but it's not merely a translation. One of those things that, if we accept the story, and I'm asking you just for the purposes of the class, for the literature, accept it as it is, one of the things that's interesting is not only does each of these 72 translators translate it identically to everybody else, they all also rearrange the books in the exact same fashion. So, you begin with the Pentateuch. Okay, that's this. That doesn't change, notice. Why? In the beginning, it'd be kind of hard to have Genesis come after, Exodus. Jews get released, they flee, Egypt, and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. Let's do a flashback. In the beginning. No, it's chronological. Okay? So the Pentateuch and the historical books are how it begins. So what are the historical books? Genesis through Esther. So I thought I put a sticky note here. I don't think I did. Yeah, there it is. Genesis through Esther. So what's that? That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Pentateuch or the law. Then Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Whoa. Joshua and Judges are prophets according to the Hebrew Old Testament. According to the writers of the Septuagint, they're history. Okay? Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, all history. Samuel's got some prophecy. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. There we are. Okay. That's a lot of historical stuff. Then, the poetic wisdom books. That is, they're both poetry and full of wisdom. Okay. Well, what are those? Back up. Job, then Psalms, then Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes, then the Song of Solomon. Okay? 5 of those. Then you have the prophets. Notice, the prophets, even though in a few modern, quote unquote Protestant versions of the Bible, they are divided into the major prophets and the minor prophets. Well, who are the prophets? Everybody from Isaiah to the end of the Old Testament. So that's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. This is on Roman numeral 19 at the beginning of your book. Beginning of the Orthodox Oxford Bible. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay? So that's what comes in there. Plus, there are several other works in the Septuagint that don't show up in the Hebrew Old Testament. And for this list, you got to turn to almost the very back of your book, after all the how to read the Bible and all that kind of stuff, to the section titled the Apocrypha. Okay? Roman numeral 5, before you get to page numbers again. And you have the list of the books of the Apocrypha. First book of Esdras, second book of Esdras, Tobit, Judith, additions to the book of Esther, the wisdom of Solomon, wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, Baruch, letter of Jeremiah, prayer of Azariah, and the song of the 3 young men. That's, by the way, the 3 men in the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel. Okay. Susanna, Bella and the dragon, the prayer of Manasseh, the 4 books of Maccabees. And then Psalm 151. So where do these come from? Well, some of them are translations from Hebrew. We can tell by the idiom, by the forms of speech. Okay? Some of them are just entirely Greek. Okay? Now here's what gets kind of interesting. Some of these are included in what today are called the Bible. If you're Catholic, for example, and you use a Catholic Bible, you don't use the authorized version, King James, the revised authorized version, like this one, your Old Testament has these in it. I'm Orthodox. The Orthodox Bible has almost all of these. There's one or two of those, I can't remember which, that aren't included. So why are some included and some aren't? Well, in the early period after Christ, roughly 100 to 400, various groups of people kind of met, and those various groups of people said, these books belong and these books don't. One of those groups of people was a council of Jewish elders. Okay? Can't remember the exact date they met. I've been reading a lot and it's out of my mind. Council is called the Council of Jamnia, Jamnia. And in that council, they reaffirm, so to speak, these are the books of the Old Testament. Because they have some of those. Okay? They're fully familiar with the Septuagint. Why? Time of Christ, very few Jews read Hebrew. Those who could read did read Greek. Why? Israel exists where? It's a crossroads from Africa, Egypt, and Europe, essentially, or the North Mediterranean. A lot of trade going on. Greek is the dominant language throughout the area. It's what's called, in French, the lingua franca, the common language, so to speak. Peasants wouldn't know Greek, or lower class, Christ probably, for example, didn't speak Greek. Definitely spoke Aramaic, okay? But he probably read Greek. How do we know? In the New Testament, when Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, he's quoting this every time. He quotes from the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, as do the apostles when they quote. There's a couple instances, where they do quote from the Hebrew, right? But it's like 98% of the time, it's from this version, okay? Which is why it's important. They don't ever quote from this, which is why the early Christian church, early on, some say, well, this doesn't belong. Why? Because they never quote from it. And then the reformers, we'll maybe talk about them later, Calvin, Luther, etc., they don't acknowledge any of this because it's never quoted by Christ specifically. Right? So, some modern Bibles will have this embedded within the Old Testament. Others will have it like this one has it, appended to the end. Okay. For some, the Apocrypha is called, let me back up. All of this both sides, are what's called canonical. What does canonical mean? It meets what's called the rule of faith. That is, these are books that ought to be read, that are beneficial to be read, and that have been granted, so to speak, the authority or the recognition of divine inspiration. Divine inspiration is not the same, however, as divine dictation. The Hebrews, the early Christian church, did not imagine that the scriptures were written by some guy sitting at a table with a stylus and a piece of papyrus, and God was whispering in his ear. Though there are icons that show that. That show a dove at somebody's ear, the Holy Spirit descending like a dove, according to John's Gospel, that show a dove at a guy's ear, and he's sitting there, No, it's, inspiration. They have these ideas, they get acknowledged of what they are. This material, right down low, is called deuterocanonical, which means second level. It's not necessary for the faith, but it can be beneficial. It can be helpful. It can help us to understand. And much of the Apocrypha, some of the Apocrypha bridges that 400-year gap that I talked about. Malachi here is around 400 BC, 400 years before Christ. Well, before Book of Maccabees, the Maccabees are real people. They were people who led a revolt against their, not Roman, pre-Roman, rulers. They tried to fight them off and overthrow them, etc., etc. Okay? In like the 2nd century BC. I think it was the 2nd century. Okay? So you get, a little bit of coming closer, closer, closer. By the way, that 400-year gap, why is that significant or why is that important? What are the prophets? That's one of the things. The prophets are promising the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites. Who's going to come? Sure. Yes, between Malachi and Matthew. Okay. Matthew opens the New Testament. Okay. Well, one of the things the prophets all are about, especially when you get to Hosea and Malachi, they're all about the coming day of the Lord. That's not necessarily Judgment Day. It is implied in some contexts, and in fact, in some of the contexts, it's the coming of the Messiah will be the ultimate final Judgment Day. So, what are they doing? For 400 years, what are they waiting for? When's he coming? When's he coming? It's almost kind of like the return of the king, for those of you who are Tolkien fans. It's why, Aragorn is so important within that novel. The king's not around, right? For 400 years. Who rules the Jews? Not Jews. Who do they want to rule them? Jews. Who specifically? The Christ. Christ comes from the word chrism, the anointed one, the Messiah, the son of David, etc. For 400 years, he's not there. Well, this, provides a little. Meanwhile, while waiting for the Christ, here what else is going on. And then Matthew opens, and it talks about the birth of Christ, the anointed one, the Son of Man, all the language that's used in the Old Testament to describe the person who will do what for the Jews? Save them, not spiritually, politically, militarily, governmentally. This person will be a what? Like Samson, like Joshua, like Moses, a deliverer. He will deliver them from their bondage to their overlords, etc., etc. Okay. Any other questions about all this stuff? None? All right. Yes?
Wait, so, you know how they have, the concordances where you can look at,
Yep.
say, King James Version compared to, what the Hebrew says? So, is all the Hebrew in those concordances from the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No, it's not all from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there are other major manuscripts. For example, there is the Geniza fragments, portions of the Old Testament in Hebrew and Aramaic, also discovered in 1947. But these in an old synagogue in Cairo. Those date from about 400 AD. Okay? There's another group of manuscripts copied by a family over several generations. Okay? Earliest of which from about 700 AD, latest of which from 950 AD. There's another book, the Aleppo Codex. If you're at all aware of the news, you might be familiar with that name, Aleppo, because it's a city in Syria that's been in the news over about the past 5 years. From ISIS capturing it, and then Assad's people taking it back, and then ISIS capturing it again, and then Assad's people take it. It's an old city, okay? The Aleppo Codex contains the complete Old Testament. It's from about 950 AD. So it's 1,500 years after all of the last events that are recorded in the Old Testament. Okay? Codex Leningradinensis, can't say that word. What does that mean? The Book of Leningrad, that is. It's a Hebrew version of the Bible that was in what is now St. Petersburg. Complete Old Testament in Hebrew, copied by the last member of that family that I mentioned before that kept, making copies of manuscripts, 1008 AD. Okay? So those are the oldest versions of that. There are translations of the Old Testament into Aramaic, the language of Jesus, the language that was spoken by the Jews after they got carried off into Babylon. The earliest of those translations are from about 400 BC, so those even predate this, but they're translations. And they're not only translations, they're also commentary. That is, this is what it's really meant by, kind of a thing. Okay? Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How did I know that Jesus was quoting from the Septuagint Old Testament and not the Hebrew Old Testament?
Because the language he uses, the language of the Gospels doesn't suddenly say, and Jesus spoke this in Greek. It's because the phrasing he uses comes from the Septuagint. The Septuagint, in several passages, I'll bring this, because I don't think I have it with me right now. There are some examples in your introduction, I think. No, they're not. I'll bring this. There are numerous examples where the wording of a passage in the Septuagint differs from the passage in the Old Testament. That is, it's not just a strict literal translation. It's like a different version. Okay? Christ quotes from that Septuagint version of it. And those differences are not little minor things. It's not like the Hebrew refers to a body of water as a lake, and the Septuagint refers to it as a pool. It might be like where the Hebrew refers to a body of water as a lake, and the Septuagint, it's the ocean. Well, there's a difference between the lake and the ocean, and, how are they, within their context, how do they mean what they mean? Okay? I'll bring in, I've actually got a listing. I will, I'll put that on D2L, okay? It's a list of all the quotations in the New Testament from the Old Testament. That'll show you the differences between the two.
I think what you're looking for is on page Roman numeral 15. The Hebrew and Greek scriptures. Let instead of hinder, prevent, supersede.
Hebrew, no, that's 25. That's why I'm not finding it. That's 19. Yeah, there's some. On Roman numeral 15, there are some, I want to say earlier. No, it's not there. Yeah, that's more getting at the King James. The King James, we got 15 minutes left. The King James includes material that is no longer included in many Bibles. Not a lot. It's not like, it just throws in books and chapters wholesale. But verses, portions of verses, that aren't included in most other modern versions of the Bible, because the King James was based on a quote-unquote poor text. That is, it had a poor what's called copy text. A copy text is the material you copy from and translate. Okay, it had about a total of 8 manuscript versions that it worked from. These guys, they're working from over 5,000 copies, or portions, for example, of the New Testament, of copies of the New Testament. Some of those complete, going as far back as 300, 350 AD. The translators of the King James Bible in 1611 did not know of the existence of those manuscripts. Okay? So, for example, the book of Mark. Shouldn't go there, but we will. Book of Mark. I don't know if this is going to include it because I haven't looked at it yet. It might include it as a footnote. Or it might have a footnote to it. Let's see. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Yeah, page 1239. At the end of Mark 16. At the very end of Mark 16, you have the word amen. What's amen mean?
So be it.
So be it. No. Some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. Well, the end of verse 8 is, the angel speaking to them says, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they led him. Go tell his disciples and Peter, blah, blah, blah." And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Okay? So, some of the most ancient authorities in the book of Mark there. One authority concludes the book by adding this verse shortly thereafter. "But they reported briefly to Peter and those, blah, 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 blah." Other authorities include that preceding passage, that kind of that verse 9 that gets added. And then they continue with verses 9 through 20. In most authorities, verses 9 through 20 follow immediately after verse 8. A few authorities insert additional material after verse 14. What's meant by authorities? Manuscripts. Manuscripts. When it says, some of the most ancient authorities, that's a couple of the oldest complete versions of the New Testament. One of them is a manuscript, the most of which, take that back, some of which is at Mount Sinai, the Mount Sinai. It's at a monastery there. It dates from about 300, 350 AD. The rest of it, by the way, it's at the British Library in London. That's one of the most important manuscripts for the New Testament because it's complete and it's early. That is, it's almost about as close to the writers of the New Testament as there is. Okay? Little thing about, editing. My dissertation was in textual editing and stuff. The more you copy something, what happens? Think gossip. The more something is said by somebody, what happens with the something that is said? It changes. Same thing happens with copying. I could give a sheet of paper with something written on it and ask every one of you to copy it. And I would probably end up with 20 out of 22, at least 20 different versions. Now, those different versions might be only a letter or word or a mark of punctuation different. Some of them might be radically different because as you're copying, you might not see a comma as important, so you might drop off most marks of punctuation. Same thing happens with copying, especially by hand. Okay? All right. Let's jump to Genesis. Obviously, we're not going to go line by line or verse by verse through Genesis 1 through, what do I have on the syllabus? 1 through 11. Okay? So, you got a little introduction. Not going to talk about the introduction much. Other than, notice the division. Because the division is what I follow in the syllabus. Okay? Yeah, I changed it slightly. 2 main sections. 1 through 11 deal with primeval history. It's not history because it's not written down. It's not literally speaking. And then 12 through 50 treat of the history of the fathers or the patriarchs of Israel. So 1 through 11, creation through what?
Abraham.
Yeah, just before Abraham. Tower of Babel's included in there. What else? So creation, 7 days of creation. What's meant by days? Is it 7 literal days? I mean, literally speaking, if you're talking about what the Bible says in it, and quote unquote, and I'm not going to get all interpretive stuff, science, it can't be. Why? It ends with, let there be light, there was light, God saw the light was good, God separated the light from the darkness, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Notice what comes first. There was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Notice the chronology there. Don't we tend to do it the other way around? The day begins how? The day. It ends with the evening. Biblical time is just the opposite. It kind of starts in the evening and goes to the following evening, so to speak. That's why the Sabbath occurs beginning on sundown and then goes through the following day. Okay? So, and then he does what? He separates the firmament in the midst, the firmament in the midst of the waters, separates it from the heavens and the earth, etc., and we keep going on. There's evening, there's morning, second day, third day, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens. Whoa. What lights in the firmament of the heavens? A greater light to rule the day, a lesser light to rule the night. What are those? Obviously, the sun and the moon. Well, we can't have our literal 24-hour day, right? Without the sun. So the first day, light, separating the light from the darkness, that's not the sun. That's light. Light in general, the idea, I don't know. Okay? Keeps going on. Verse 26. After he makes animals, sea creatures, birds and stuff, then let us make man in our image, after our likeness, let them. This isn't, quote, I'm being facetious here, obviously. This isn't God being politically correct. I was going to show something. I can't. I was going to show something to you today to show how utterly asinine political correctness can be. It's I completely forget entirely what it was. It's a painting. Instagram. Come on. It's not a painting. It's a photograph. Right? It's a photograph of this guy. He's asleep. Big deal, right? It's an early photograph. The photograph was taken by a famous photographer, kind of early, not creator photography, but important guy, right? The note talks about, are you addicted to selfies, blah, 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 blah. And it ends. Listen to the language here. Here, the sleeping figure, right? Figure, singular. Here, the sleeping figure suddenly places their right arm. There. Their. The sleeping figure, one, their, plural, two. Why did the British Library put there? This is my supposition. I could be entirely wrong. But because I know some things about the British Library, I don't think I'm wrong. They don't want to use a male pronoun. They don't want to exclude anybody. There, it's taught today, using those third-person plural pronouns, you can't be sexist. You can't be gendered because there's no gender. And yet, we're talking about what? One person. This is not a plurality. And it's pretty clear. What else? He's male. This is before all the genders that, the 27 or 57, whatever Facebook has now. Okay? Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them. Well, is God being politically correct? No. So is that just a grammatical error? Because let us make man, and then we get them? No. What's meant by man?
Human.
Bingo. Let's make the humankind. And we know it's what? It's inclusive because of the them. Okay? God's telling us there's going to be more than one. Right? And give him dominion, blah, 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 blah. So, he created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Him. Male and female. What's the him referred to? All of us. All of us. Okay? And told them what to do. And then what happens? Then we get chapter 2, and we get another version of creation. Is it another version? Because that's the way most biblical literary scholars look at this. It's a different version. It's a different story. It's a different narrator. Okay? Is it? Or is it merely an opening up? That is, I've given you one story. Now let's pull the layers back. And let's go a little more in depth so we get that. So, he creates Adam and Eve, and what do? When?
After they're true.
Okay? So he puts them in the garden. He says you can have anything you want. They're total vegetarian, by the way. Have anything you want. But here's one tree. I don't have another bottle. And here's another tree. Don't touch them. Okay. Everything else is yours. But leave these two alone. Why? Think story. What is God introducing, so to speak, story-wise at this point? Don't think theology. Don't think spirituality. Don't think, Christianity, etc. Just story. What must every story have?
Conflict.
Louder? An antagonist. Somebody said it over here. Conflict. God introduces the element of conflict. What's that element? Go back to when you were 5 years old. If your family celebrated Christmas and you had a Christmas tree and your parents were anything like mine, they tried to put some presents out before Christmas Eve. And so you got a tree and there's presents underneath it. And what can't you do? Open them, maybe touch them. That's really cruel, You can look, but don't touch, It's like putting a plate of cookies out before dinner. No, that's for after dinner. Okay? For what purpose? There's only one purpose. Is it temptation? Is it God going, I'm going to make them fall? Or is it a simple test? Okay? We'll stop there. And we'll get caught up. Because we won't have any more of this background stuff. Okay, I will put those the stuff about the quotations from the Septuagint up later on today or tomorrow.